Paul. Dr. Paul grew up in Lake Jackson, Texas, and attended Baylor University. He graduated from Duke Medical School in 1988, and after completing a general surgery internship and residency, Dr. Paul and his wife Kelly moved to Bowling Green to make their home and begin his ophthalmology practice. In 1995, Dr. Paul founded the Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic, an organization that provides eye exams and surgery to those in need. He is a former president and 17-year member of the Lions Club International, which is dedicated to preserving sight by providing eyeglasses and surgery to the less fortunate around the world. In his free time, Dr. Paul performs pro bono eye surgeries for patients across Kentucky and around the globe. In fact, he just recently participated in a mission program with Children of the Americas in Guatemala and Haiti. And on that visit, assisted more than 200 patients in restoring their sight. Dr. Paul says that his entrance into politics and election to the U.S. Senate in 2010 reflects his work as a surgeon, a desire to diagnose problems and provide practical solutions. Won't you join me in giving a warm Rotary welcome to U.S. Senator Dr. Rand Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. When I first got to Bowling Green, I thought, I wanted to join a service organization, so I came to Rotary. Then I found out there was a singing requirement. I tried out, and they told me that the Lions Club met on Tuesday, and I might need to go there. But no, I enjoy coming to Rotary. As Alice mentioned, I was in Haiti last year, and my friend, who I think is still here, Rob Porter's in Rotary down in Bowling Green, he said, well, I'll come and we'll take some water systems. So we, in both Guatemala and in Haiti, also took some Rotarian water systems down and did that in addition to the eye surgery, which is, a great thing, I think, to try to provide people with clean water, and just amazing to, when you think about something we take so for granted, that we can turn on the faucet and be able to drink the water. In politics, there are certain minefields that you run into, and this is different than being a physician. I never knew I would have to worry about whether I supported U of L or UK, or in my case, Western. But you see some crazy things happen, and politicians say some crazy things when they really, really want to win, and they really, really want to show you that they support your team, whichever city that happens to be that they're in. So they asked one of the presidential candidates, she had been to Stanford, and they were playing Iowa, who you for? And of course she assured them she was for Iowa. But I think sometimes finally people will look at something and say, well, that's crazy to say, because you just happen to be somewhere that you happen to be for that team over the school you went to. But we have some crazy things that go on. So I'm up in New Hampshire 6 months ago or so, and they told me, whatever you do, don't say anything about Inflategate or Tom Brady. But people who know me know that I can't resist. And so I told them that, the controversy had come all the way to Kentucky. In fact, the controversy had come all the way to my bedroom, because it seems that Tom Brady was down here, and I don't know if any of you saw him, he was at the Kentucky Derby. And so, of course, my wife met him and wanted to have her picture taken with him. And then I go away on a campaign trip, and I come back, and there's Tom Brady and my wife on the mantle, or on the dresser, in my bedroom. So I said, this will not survive. He's got to go somewhere else. I'm not going to wake up in the morning and see Tom Brady with my wife. So she moved him to the sunroom, and we go out to dinner, and we come back, and his picture has disappeared. Turns out my son did have real opinions on Inflategate, and he had stolen the picture. But I think we've got it all worked out. We have matrimonial harmony, and everything's kind of coming back together. But I do think that there are things that we want out of politics that may be a little bit more serious. We want maybe people that are more genuine about things, and that things get beyond sort of the superficial. But I think you still have to be wary of the minefields. When I first came to Kentucky, I came from this school that over in North Carolina that has 4 letters. And I thought it was a well-respected school and that I would put my medical diploma up there and that people would be proud of it. But I moved to Bowling Green in 1993, and let's see, there was this guy named Christian Leitner who makes his shot in 1992. So I finally had to take my diploma down and put it in a different office where it couldn't be seen. And we usually take that out of the bio so it doesn't get mentioned, so I don't get in trouble. I think there are things, though, that do bring us together, no matter which party we're in, and things that we can work together on. One of those I wrote about this morning in the newspaper, and that's criminal justice reform. As I've traveled not only around Kentucky but around the country, I've met a lot of people who say that they're still struggling for a mistake they made when they were 21 years old. Often a mistake involving drugs, often a nonviolent crime, but it's stuck with them for the rest of their life, whether it's voting or employment. In fact, when people talk about the Voting Rights Act and different things like this, I tell them the number one impediment to voting in our country and the number one impediment to getting a job in our country is actually having a previous criminal record. So I think people do deserve a second chance. And I think people are coming together on this. In the state legislature, I think in the Senate and the House, they've passed an expungement bill. I don't think that it's exactly the same yet, but hopefully it will wind up and come through conference committee. And we will have a bill that says, you know, you've served your time and you're behaving. It was a nonviolent minor crime, and we're going to let you get a second chance. I think a lot of corporations are seeing this. And I think this is something that we can work together. But I think there's a lot to be done. And I'll give you a couple of examples where I think we have not necessarily, been successful yet in fixing the problem. There are people who sometimes get trapped in these things who really are ending up with penalties that are disproportionate to the crime. I'll give you an example. I met with one of the public defenders here in town, and he brought a woman who had been in a lot of trouble. I mean, meth, crack, you name it, she'd been involved with it. She had 2 kids, and she'd been a terrible mother. She'd been in and out of prison. She was accused now of a crime and awaiting a sentence. But in the last 6 months, she'd gotten clean, she'd found religion, and she seemed to be doing better. No guarantees that she wasn't, but she was facing a 15-year sentence. 15 years, and the judge has no discretion. So the judge can't listen to, she's found religion, she's clean, she's no longer using drugs, she has 2 kids, and we're going to give her a chance. And so I am arguing that we should have more discretion for our judges to try to find justice. I'm also arguing that some of these minor felonies, we make them misdemeanors. In California, they made some of these things misdemeanors, and what was happening in California is the prisons were so full that they were turning out violent criminals early because the federal judges said the prisons are too full and we have to turn people out. I think that what happened is they passed Proposition 47, made some of these things misdemeanors. Now the prisons have plenty of room, but there's less people in for nonviolent crimes. And I think we can still figure it out. I'm a big advocate for the drug courts. I think the drug courts do sort things out. We want to get people to work. We want to get people integrated. Will it always work? No. We're talking about people who are drug abusers. 1 in 3, maybe half are going to fail. But if half can succeed and we can integrate them back into society, I think we ought to. I think it's also something that brings right and left back together on. I have a bill to restore federal voting rights with Harry Reid. I have a bill to restore and expunge records with Cory Booker. So it's something that we are able to work, I think, on both sides of the issue, and I think people are evolving on a lot of these things. There still will be people, it's a risky proposition. There will be people that you knock down their crime and end up recommitting crimes. Bad people sometimes recommit crimes, but there will be a certain percentage that I think can get a second chance. You won't hear a lot of times in the newspaper me complimenting the president, but it's one thing I'm willing to compliment the president on that we agree on. He's commuted some of the sentences. I don't know if when you were watching, I think it was when the Broncos were playing the Patriots in the playoffs, Peyton Manning gave the ball to Demaryius Thomas for his mother. Demaryius Thomas's mother had been in jail for 15 years for a drug crime. It wasn't an insignificant crime, but we have to decide whether 15 years or life in prison is really what we want. There was a nursing assistant. Rolling Stone did a good article and compiled a lot of these things. There was a nursing assistant or a nurse who falsified a prescription. She was 31 years old, and this should be illegal. She should be punished, but she was given 15 years mandatory minimum. There was a young guy by the name of Timothy Tyler who was not only an LSD user but was selling some of it through the mail. And once you go through the mail, it really does become a federal crime. He was given life in prison. He was 23 at the time. He's 46 now. He still will spend the rest of his life. I personally think I'd like to make more room for the murderers, the rapists, the thugs, the assault, and maybe figure that we can give some of these people a second chance. And I think it's something that we all can come together on. Other things that I think should bring us together on, and I think one of the false messages or one of the false narratives that we have out there is the media tells you that we don't get along at all, that we're always at each other's throat, and there's terrible gridlock and nothing can get done. It's actually kind of the opposite. We get along swimmingly well. The conversations are usually pretty pleasant across party aisle, and really things do get done. Unfortunately, I think the wrong things are getting done. So for example, the loudest voices in Washington, and you won't hear this, but the loudest voices in Washington for increasing spending are Republican. They just want it for the military. But they know the only way they can do it is to talk with the Democrats and give the Democrats increased spending for domestic spending. So we get both. So spending's really going through the roof. But whose fault is it? Democrats? Republicans? There's enough fault to go around. We need the other kind of compromise. Instead of compromising to raise all of spending, we need to compromise to lower all of spending or to hold the line. You can actually balance your annual federal budget by just cutting 1 penny out of every dollar for 5 years. You say, well, how could that be? I thought we'd have to cut trillions of dollars. In Washington, they measure the baseline on an incline. It's not really a baseline, it's an incline. Government spending goes up automatically about 5% a year. So you heard about this sequester. I don't think anybody really knows what the sequester is. The sequester was a slowdown in the rate of growth of spending. And yet everybody's, oh my goodness, the sequester's crippling us. We can't live with the sequester. All spending was still going up under the sequester. In fact, I think people are so removed from the knowledge of what a sequester is that there was a Jimmy Kimmel skit, and Jimmy Kimmel goes to the man on the street, and there are a few uninformed people on the street in America, and he goes up to him and he says, did you hear that President Obama has banned the sequester and sent it to North Korea? And they're like, damn right, they deserve it. But the bottom line is we made it out to be something terrible, and all it is a slowdown in the rate of spending. But this is where the real problem is, and I don't think we're hearing enough of what the actual truth is. Republicans were loud voices for getting rid of the sequester. They did cooperate with Democrats, and you got more spending. We borrow $1 million a minute. We have a $19 trillion debt. If you want to imagine how big $1 trillion is, take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand 4 inches high and you'll have $1 million. If you take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand and you want to have $1 trillion, it'd be 63 miles high. Imagine 19 stacks of 63 miles of $1,000 bills, and that's what we've got. Some people say, it doesn't matter, it's just a big number, it doesn't matter to me. Well, economists say that it's an anvil that we're dragging around, that it costs us about 1 million jobs a year, that having a growth rate of 1.5% instead of having a growth rate of 3% really means the difference between millions of jobs, that we do owe it to ourselves, but it's one of the leading items of expenditure. Just the interest on the debt's $255 billion a year. That's more than we spend for the Department of Education, plus the Department of Commerce, plus the Department of Housing and Urban Development. All three of those are just equal to our interest payment. It is a problem. That's with paying interest at 2%. What if we get 5% interest? What if you get 10% interest? We might not be able to bear the burden at 10%. It could lead to a destruction of the currency. It could lead to a destruction of the country. It could lead to violence and chaos. You say, well, that's just too much. No way. I don't know. We can't always control interest rates. The Federal Reserve thinks they can always control interest rates. We'll see what happens. Some of you might say, well, we need spending. I've got this project that's a really good project. We need spending for this. Well, What I tell people is what I tell everybody that comes to Washington. If you want money for something, tell me what you don't want me to spend it on, and we'll see if there's enough. We bring in $3 trillion. We probably do have enough money for some good items and for some good expenditures. But we can't bring in $3 trillion and spend $3.8 trillion. But I'll give you a couple of examples of things that you need to harangue your representatives, harangue your senators, harangue your president over. We do a waste report every week, and it is just amazing to me. We actually did our own bracketology. Instead of signing up for which basketball team you thought won, we had all these different waste projects, and we pitted them against each other until we had a winner. The winner was we spent $100,000 giving it to El Salvadoran deportees, people who came in illegal into this country. We sent them back after they broke the law, but then we gave them a check so they could start a small business in El Salvador. We spent $2.5 million last year studying online dating to see if people made their choices based on physical appearance. You think? So I'm over in Butler County the other day, and they say the Rochester Dam's older than I am, and it needs to be repaired or replaced. And look, I'm for small government, but I think we could find money to replace or repair a dam or a highway or a road, but that's about as much as we spend studying online dating. We spent $43 million in Afghanistan developing a natural gas station. First problem is that's none of our business. We borrow $1 million a minute. We got to borrow it from China to send it to Afghanistan to build a gas station for a country where only 1 in 10,000 people have a car, and nobody's got a car that runs on natural gas. We spend $15 million a year on free community college for foreign students. We spent $250,000 in bringing over 24 students from Pakistan to send them to space camp in Alabama. So when you think we don't have enough money for our schools or for our roads or for our teachers, come to Washington and tell me that we need to play hardball. We need to cut out the waste and the frivolous things that go on. And they're in all aspects of the budget. But here's the bottom line. Do you think any manager of your money is going to squeeze out waste if you're increasing their budget? So when we get rid of the sequester should squeeze the waste out. If I give you, any of you in your business, 5% less money to deal with, what will you do? You'll go through with a fine-tooth comb and squeeze it out. If I give you 5% more money, you'll be less likely to squeeze out the waste. When times are good, people eat in 5-star dining and stay in big hotels. When times are bad, people look at their expenditures. Maybe we shouldn't send the GSA to $1 million conferences in Las Vegas. You got to be careful in Congress. The Nevada people don't like it if you want to limit, them flying to Las Vegas. But there's a lot of places where we could cut expenditures. I think one of the things that really is one of the root causes of our problem is that we don't get rid of waste, we don't get rid of spending excess because we have a broken system of how we spend our money. We lurch from deadline to deadline. So every year there's got to be some kind of bill that has the spending in it. Traditionally, we divided government into 12 units, and we had 12 appropriation bills. We would pass them one at a time, and if I were looking at the Pentagon's bill, I would say, well, you know what? I think it's ridiculous to be building natural gas stations for 100 times the cost in foreign countries. Or I might say, as I did last week, that spending $350 million to buy F-16s for Pakistan is not a great idea. We don't have the money. Besides, I think Pakistan, we've given them $15 billion. I call them a frenemy at best. They're friends when you look at them. The minute you look away, they're your enemy. I mean, look, Pakistan was one of the only countries that supported the Taliban and recognized the Taliban, gave them money and arms while they were hosting bin Laden. When we chased bin Laden out of Afghanistan, where does he go? Pakistan. He lives for 10 years a mile away from their military academy in a compound with 15-foot walls. How many people you think lived in that city in compounds with 15-foot walls? Half a dozen, maybe? And they didn't know he was there? In Pakistan, if you convert from Islam to Christianity, it's the death penalty. If you marry a Christian, it can be the death penalty. If you criticize the state religion, it can be the death penalty. You think it never happens? Asia Bibi is a Christian in Pakistan. There's only 2% Christian in Pakistan. She sits on death row because she went to the village to draw water from the well, and as she was drawing water from the well, they began stoning her and beating her with sticks and chanting, "Death, death to the Christian." And as she lay there bleeding, she's crying out for help. The police finally show up. She thinks she's saved, only to be arrested for criticizing the state religion. Gossipy, they can arrest you for gossips in town saying you're criticizing the religion, which happens because there's very few Christians left in Pakistan. We shouldn't be furthering and abetting these regimes. We have to decide what we're going to do. The Iraq war cost us $1 trillion. Are we safer? Is Iraq more stable? Is the Middle East more stable? So we have to decide what you want from government and what we're going to do. One of the fundamental problems we have is that there's been a collapse of the separation of powers. We're supposed to have co-equal branches of government. They're supposed to check and balance each other. Madison said we would pit ambition against ambition. The ambition of Congress to want more power would be checked by the president's ambition to want more power. But now what we have is basically a government largely run by one person, the president. There's very little checks and balances. In fact, I would say the president is 1,000-fold more powerful than Congress. That didn't happen just with this president. Probably started with Woodrow Wilson. It increased greatly with FDR. But when the president got frustrated and he said, the Republicans in Congress won't do what I want them to do. I've got a pen, I've got a phone, I'm going to do what I want. He just began writing regulations. We can have a variety of opinions about what to do about immigration, but we shouldn't let one person say, we're just not going to prosecute anybody for immigration violations. We're just going to say, whatever goes, goes. Problem with that also is it becomes a beacon to the rest of the world. Say, we don't have any immigration laws and we don't have any border, so more come. We have to decide whether or not the president writes the laws or whether Congress does. We have to decide whether we want checks and balances. Montesquieu was one of the philosophers that Jefferson and others looked to when writing the Constitution and talking about separation of powers. And Montesquieu said that when the executive begins to legislate, a form of tyranny will ensue. But we have people on my side. We've got one candidate, I can't remember his name, the rich guy from New York. He says give him power and he'll fix everything. He's just a better manager than everybody else and he's so rich he must be smart. And so he'll fix it if you just give him power. But to my mind, I come from a philosophy that I don't care if you're my twin brother. I don't want you to have more power. I want the government to have less power in Washington and have the power more devolved and separated and split because power corrupts. That's what Lord Acton said. He said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We wanted to minimize how much power. Our founding fathers were concerned we could get a king. So when I tell you I don't like President Obama writing executive orders, I'd say exactly the same whether it was a Republican or a Democrat, because power is a corrupting influence, and we've let too much power gravitate into the hands of one person in the White House. We have other problems in our country. We have now one candidate who says that he's a socialist, but he says, don't worry, he's a democratic socialist. The implication is that if the majority votes for it, it must be okay, that majorities are always good. It's one of the questions I ask school children when they come to Washington. Are we a democracy or are we a constitutional republic? There's a big difference. Our founding fathers hated the idea of democracy. But also majorities can do things that are very, very wrong. Think of what the majority did in about 1910, maybe 1912 in Louisville. Majority of I think it was the city majority, voted to have legalized segregation. They had a housing ordinance, said white person can't sell a house to a black person, but it was done by a majority, done by a democracy. Does that make it right? One of the most famous Louisvillians, who is not known by anyone, that sounds like a Yogi Berraism, I think, is a guy named William Worley. And William Worley was an attorney here in town, and he was a founding member of the NAACP, and he fought a case. And it's a famous case, but somewhat obscured in time. It's called Buchanan versus Worley. And he overturned at the Supreme Court level the Louisville segregation ordinance. But think about what he's overturning. He's doing something that I think was absolutely right, but he's overturning the will of a majority. Majorities aren't always right. That's why we have rights and powers that are defined in the Constitution that are separate from majorities. We don't allow a majority to take away the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment. Think of when majorities got it wrong. One of the most famous dissents is by Justice Harlan in Plessy versus Ferguson, when he says, we are not a society that's based on race or class or caste. But he lost, and the court was wrong for 50 years. Think of Berea College, a shining example of integration right after the Civil War for 30 or 40 years, but then a majority in the state legislature of Kentucky said it's going to be illegal. They didn't even just say we're going to have segregation, they said it's going to be illegal to have integration. And the Supreme Court unfortunately did uphold that in about 1905. I'm reminded of from To Kill a Mockingbird, when Jim comes to his father Atticus and he says, the majority of people think that you're wrong to defend Tom Robinson. And Atticus says to his son, he says, before you can learn to live with others, you have to learn to live with yourself. And the only thing that doesn't abide majority rule is conscience. That's the way I kind of look at the Constitution, that it is our conscience, that it knows what is right and wrong, and we defined a series of right and wrong, not always in the moral sense, but right and wrong in the terms of power and having power limited and not having too much power accumulate and having this separation of power where we check and balance each other's. Gridlock means we're having a discussion. If you go too rapidly and you get too much legislation that's all being flooded through, we're not having compromise, we're having the will of one person. We need to restore the checks and balances. We need to restore the fiscal integrity of our budget. And we need to understand what did make our country great. What made us great was the rule of law, that you can have secure title to your home. That's the origin of most of capitalism, that you can be secure in trading and you can be free to trade with your neighbor voluntarily, and you can accumulate wealth and you can use the fruits of your labor as you wish. But that system is capitalism, and it's distinct from communism. So when the president goes to Cuba and says, communism and capitalism aren't really that different and whatever works for you, that is a dumbing down and intellectual sort of obfuscation of what made us great. We are distinct from communism. There is a distinct difference between freedom and slavery. If we understand that, if we understand that our founding fathers were incredible in what they bequeathed to us, that the rule of law is incredibly important, that private property is incredibly important, that the increase in the development of capital is what allows us to be the most humanitarian country in the planet, or maybe in the history of mankind. In 2014, and many of you are involved in charity, and Rotary is a charity, but in 2014, we gave away privately, not the government, you privately, to your churches, to your synagogues, we gave away privately nearly $400 billion. That does not happen in Cuba, that did not happen in the Soviet Union, and that did not happen in Venezuela, because the corruption of violence and depravity and poverty that goes along with socialism is terrible. And so if I could say anything and any message to leave you with, there's a difference between communism and capitalism. There's a difference between us and the Soviet Union. We need to be proud of it, we need to accentuate it, and we need to restore it. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you so much, and we have time for a few questions. Just to note, this is an official town hall meeting in Senator Paul's role as a U.S. Senator, so he's not taking questions about the election.
You mean I didn't filibuster long enough to be rid of all questions?
But he is taking questions from Rotarians, and remember, Rotarians only, 30 seconds or less, and try not to editorialize and just ask a question. And I'm going to kick it off, if I can, real quick with one question about the drug epidemic. So as a healthcare provider, our ERs are flooded with people who overdosed on heroin, other opiates. What do you think the federal government's role is in addressing the drug epidemic?
First, do no harm, that we should try not to get in the way of, rehabilitation, of trying to fix the problem. So one of the pieces of legislation that I put forward is actually to let doctors see more patients. There's actually a limit when a doctor or a nurse practitioner sees an addict and wants to prescribe them Suboxone, which is a replacement treatment for heroin, we say you can only see 100 patients. I know from experience there aren't that many doctors who really want to see addicts. And so since we have a limited amount of doctors and nurses doing it, why would we want to limit how many patients they see? So we have a bill that I have with a Democrat senator from Massachusetts to open that up. We also just passed an opioid bill recently, which will have more federal funding for rehabilitation and deterrence.
Wonderful. Harriet.
Hi, Harriet Friedlander. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. If we talk about both sides of the House working together, our president has done his job by putting forth the name of a Supreme Court nominee. Can you address the issue that our other senator is saying that will not be addressed in the Senate? Thank you.
Good question. We have a significant constitutional disagreement going on between Congress and the presidency. We feel that the laws should originate in Congress. He feels that he's frustrated Congress won't do what he wants, and so he thinks he can write most of the laws. And so, for example, the greenhouse gas regulations, regulating carbon, is something that to many of us, we believe is a massive undertaking, legislative undertaking. In fact, the Supreme Court agreed about a month ago and ruled 5-4 to put a stay on those regulations until they could decide whether or not he had overstepped his bounds. So we have a constitutional conflict between us and the president. I've said and will continue to say that it's a bit of a conflict of interest to decide a constitutional question by letting him pick the decider. The court is 4-4. Now, does he have the constitutional right to pick someone? Without question. But part of the checks and balances of the Constitution are that if you feel like a president is acting illegally or unconstitutionally, you can defeat them in an election, but you can also, if you have an opposing party in Congress, you can check their power by simply not approving their nominees. And there are various ways you can do this. There have been 25 Supreme Court justices in our history that did not get a hearing, usually during contentious times with opposite parties in the White House and the Congress. It's been almost 80 years since we've approved one in the final 6 months or so of a presidency. So there's argument on both sides of the question. Everybody who's been up there a while has been a hypocrite on this issue, depending on who was in the White House. Both parties, they all are. They all will tell you one thing when it's a Republican and another thing when it's a Democrat. But both parties are absolutely guilty of it. You know, Biden, you've seen the quote by Biden saying, absolutely, we will oppose anything in the last year, of Bush's administration. Doesn't make it right or wrong, but to me the most important question is I represent Kentucky. We've lost 10,000 jobs in the war on coal. 10,000 jobs. I was just in Ashland. We lost another 100 with CSX Railroad. We lost 600 with AK Steel 2 months ago. We lost 150 in Corbin. I was out in Sturgis. We lost 200 or 300 out there. My job is to try to protect Kentucky, and I got to protect Kentucky from a president who has not shown any example that he is concerned about our jobs here, because his policies, which have been unilateral and done without our approval, are devastating to the Kentucky economy. So I'll oppose his nominee simply because I think it's bad for Kentucky.
Senator Paul, Larry Sloan, my question is, do you think, of course there's an election coming up, it's hard to predict, but do you think there's a chance for significant tax reform in the coming years?
You know, I'm for significantly reforming taxes if it means returning more money to the private sector. Kentucky will thrive more if we leave more money in Kentucky. Louisville thrives more if we leave more money in Louisville. That means you have to have smaller government in Washington and a bigger private sector. You have to have government, but we should keep government at a minimum because they don't really create useful jobs. As Thomas Paine said, government is a necessary evil, which means you got to keep it small. The chances of overall tax reform, the main thing I think that limits us, well, right now is divided government, and the opposing party isn't too interested in lowering taxes, and we are. So you have two different opinions on things. The other thing that I think limits us is people are saying, oh, it has to be revenue neutral. I would just immediately start lowering rates because we're getting clobbered. I mean, Canada's corporate income tax is 15%. Ours is 35%. Brown-Forman here in town tells me they pay close to 35%, 33, 34, 35%. They're competing with Bacardi in Bermuda paying 9. We've got companies in Ireland paying 12. We got Canada at 15. We're the highest in the entire world right now. We can't be. If we want to compete with the world, we know, and not lose these jobs, we got to immediately start lowering rates. In Canada, they just started lowering the rate. And actually in Canada, they've lowered their debt while lowering their tax rates. Sometimes you actually do get more revenue with a lower rate. But I think we've tried to make it too complicated because we say it has to be revenue neutral, and we want to give someone a tax cut, and then we want to take away some kind of deduction they have. And if they balance out, my question is, have you had a real net benefit to the economy? To me, a net benefit is more money at home and less money in Washington. I'm for it, and we'll continue to push for it, but it's still a long shot right now.
Henry, you'll get the last question. I'm sorry, Patrick and Sydney, but Senator Paul's office says he's on a tight schedule and has to leave very quickly. I'm sorry.
Senator Paul, I'm Henry Heiser, and I have a different drug question from Alice's that relates to prescription drugs. So I have a topical skin cream drug prescription, and after Medicare and other layers of insurance, it costs $70 a tube. And I can buy it for €3, or basically less than $4 in France and other places in the world. Could you address the outrageous difference in American drug prices to the world?
Most of the reason why it's a lot cheaper in Canada or in Europe is price controls. And I've had mixed feelings about allowing reimportation, but I have voted for it to try to drive prices down here. I have voted to allow drugs to be reimported. But there is problems with it. I'm not in love with the policy either, because when you allow reimportation, you're basically reimporting price controls, and price controls are a menace. And the other thing about there being more profit and higher prices in our country is we're the engine of development. That's where the development comes, is by having significant profit in our country. The ultimate answer is more competition, though. We have to figure out how to have more competition. One way is allowing reimportation, even as imperfect as it is. I think bulk negotiation of prices is also something that can help, although people often say we don't have it, and we kind of do, actually. Under Medicare Part D, when you buy Part D or you get subsidized Part D, those entities are negotiating in bulk. Now, they're separate entities, so they may not be as big as all Medicare making the negotiation, but bulk negotiations like at Walmart seem to bring things down dramatically. So I think there are ways to try to fix it, but I don't think it's mandating price controls would be the answer. If anybody wants to remember price controls, either look to what happened to the Soviet Union with feast and famine there, or just look at the gas lines that we had in our country when Jimmy Carter put on price controls on oil. Price controls never work, and they're always a disaster. But I do think there's an imperfect market, and we could do better. Thanks, everybody.